What if I told you that the quiet boy sitting in the back of the class, the one everyone overlooked, was one knock away from changing everything? This isn't just a school story. It's a story about humiliation, about assumptions, and about a moment so powerful that an entire classroom would never forget it. Imagine being 14 years old, wearing the same faded hoodie every day, hiding your worn-out shoes under your desk so no one notices, trying your best while the world keeps telling you it's not enough. Now imagine your teacher calling you out in front of everyone, telling you that you'll never succeed, that your excuses don't matter, that trying isn't good enough. And the worst part? You can't defend yourself. Because how do you explain that you stay up late helping your little sister with homework while your mom works 2 jobs? How do you explain studying under a flickering kitchen light? How do you explain being tired before life has even begun? So you stay quiet. You let them think you're lazy. You let them believe you don't care. But what if, at the exact moment your confidence is breaking, the classroom door opens, and a man in a dark suit walks in? Not just any man, a Pentagon official. And he's not there by accident. He's there for one student. The same student who was just humiliated. The same student everyone underestimated. What happens next will leave the teacher speechless. It will leave the students in shock. And it will prove one powerful truth. You should never judge someone by the seat they sit in or the clothes they wear or the grades written in red ink. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is building something the world hasn't seen yet. Stay with me until the end of the story, because what that official reveals and what the teacher is forced to confront will remind you why kindness matters, why encouragement can change a life, and why you never, ever underestimate the kid in the back row. This story isn't just emotional. It's unforgettable. Let's begin. The classroom door slammed shut with sharp bang that echoed against the pale blue walls. Enough is enough. Mrs. Reynolds' voice cut through the room like a blade. 30 students froze mid-sentence. The scratching of pencils stopped. Even the old ceiling fan seemed to hum more quietly. Her eyes were locked on one person, Daniel Harper. He sat in the last row by the window, shoulders slightly hunched, his faded gray hoodie pulled tight around him. The sleeves were a little too short, revealing thin wrists. His sneakers, once white, had turned a permanent shade of gray, the soles peeling at the sides. On his desk lay his math test paper, a large red 58% circled at the top. Mrs. Reynolds held another copy in her hand, as if it were evidence in a courtroom. "This," she said sharply, waving the paper in the air, "is exactly what happens when you don't put in effort." Daniel swallowed hard. He had put in effort. He had studied at the kitchen table the night before. If you could call it studying. The light above the stove flickered every few minutes. His little sister, Mia, kept asking him for help with her reading homework. His mother didn't come home until nearly midnight from her second shift at the diner. By the time the apartment was quiet, Daniel's eyes could barely stay open. But he never told anyone that. "I studied," he said softly, barely audible. Mrs. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Studied?" A few students in the front row exchanged glances. "Daniel," she continued, her tone dripping with disbelief, "studying means understanding the material. It means practicing. It means caring." A quiet ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through part of the room. Daniel's face burned. He stared down at the corner of his desk where someone had carved initials years ago. He focused on that scratch in the wood, trying to disappear into it. "I do care," he whispered. "Well, your grades don't show it," Mrs. Reynolds replied firmly. "Other students here managed to pass. Some even excel. What makes your situation so different?" The question wasn't really a question. It was an accusation. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. How could he explain mornings when he skipped breakfast so Mia could have the last yogurt cup? Or the days he rushed home instead of staying for tutoring because he had to pick her up from the neighbor's apartment? How could he explain that sometimes he felt tired before the day even began? He couldn't, and he wouldn't. Silence stretched across the room. Mrs. Reynolds walked slowly down the aisle between desks, her heels clicking against the floor. "Excuses," she said. "I hear excuses." "I'm not making excuses," Daniel said, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. "Then what are you making, Daniel?" she pressed. He didn't answer. The truth was, Daniel had never been the loudest student. He didn't compete for attention. He didn't crack jokes or show off. But he noticed things. He noticed how the classroom computer lagged. Whenever too many tabs were open, he noticed how the projector bulb flickered at certain angles. He noticed how the broken wall clock lost exactly 3 minutes every hour. His mind was always working, just not always on math formulas. Mrs. Reynolds stopped beside his desk. "You know what I think?" she said. "I think you decided this is good enough." Her words felt heavier than the red ink on his paper. "You sit back here. You barely participate. You turn in average work at best. If this is the effort you plan to give in life, you're going to struggle." A few students shifted in their seats. One girl in the second row looked down at her notebook, clearly uncomfortable. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He wasn't angry. He was embarrassed. Embarrassed that everyone was staring. Embarrassed that his test score was being discussed like a public announcement. Embarrassed that he couldn't defend himself without sounding like he was begging for sympathy. "I'm trying," he said again, his voice smaller now. Mrs. Reynolds sighed loudly. "Trying isn't enough," she said. "The real world doesn't reward trying. It rewards results." Those words settled over him like cold rain. Daniel had heard something similar before, from a landlord who didn't care that rent was a week late, from a store manager who refused his mother extra hours, from life in general. Results. He glanced toward the window. Beside him, outside, the sky was gray. A delivery truck passed by slowly, splashing water from a puddle. For a moment, he imagined being anywhere else. Back in his small bedroom where wires, screws, and tiny pieces of metal filled an old shoebox under his bed. That was where he felt confident. That was where he built things, small inventions made from discarded electronics neighbors threw away. In that world, mistakes weren't failures. They were adjustments. But here, mistakes were numbers in red ink. Mrs. Reynolds walked back to the front of the class. "Let this be a lesson," she announced. "Hard work shows. Or it doesn't." Daniel felt dozens of eyes on him. He wanted to shrink. He wanted the bell to ring. He wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. Instead, he picked up his pencil and pretended to review the test, though the numbers blurred through the tears he refused to let fall. He made a silent promise to himself right then. He wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. Because if there was one thing Daniel had learned from watching his mother, it was this. You endure quietly. You keep going, even when no one understands. The clock ticked. Each second felt heavier than the last. And somewhere deep inside that quiet, humiliated boy in the back row, something was shifting. Not anger, not resentment, but determination. He would prove, someday, somehow, that he was more than a red number on a piece of paper. He just didn't know that someday was closer than anyone in that room could imagine. The tension in the classroom hadn't faded. Even after Mrs. Reynolds turned back to the whiteboard and resumed explaining algebraic equations, the air still felt heavy, like something unresolved was hanging between the desks. Daniel kept his head down. He could still hear the echo of her words in his mind. The real world doesn't reward trying. It rewards results. He tightened his grip on his pencil and focused on copying the equation from the board. Then, knock, knock. The sound was calm but firm. Mrs. Reynolds paused mid-sentence. A few students looked toward the door, grateful for the interruption. "Yes," she called, slightly irritated. The door opened slowly. Standing there was Principal Harris, unusually stiff in posture. Beside him stood a tall man in a dark navy suit. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His hair was neatly trimmed, his expression serious but composed. The entire room straightened instinctively. "Good morning," Principal Harris said, clearing his throat. "Sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Reynolds." Mrs. Reynolds forced a polite smile. "Not at all. Is everything all right?" "Yes," the principal replied quickly. "This is Mr. David Thompson. He's visiting from Washington, D.C. He'll be observing a few classes today." A quiet murmur spread through the room. "Washington?" Mrs. Reynolds' posture changed immediately. Her shoulders squared. Her tone softened. "Of course," she said warmly. We're honored to have you. Mr. Thompson stepped into the classroom with calm confidence. His presence felt different, steady, intentional. Thank you for allowing me to sit in, he said. His voice was smooth but authoritative. Please continue as if I'm not here. But no one could act as if he wasn't there. Daniel barely glanced up at first. Visitors didn't concern him. He assumed this was just another district official doing routine checks. Mrs. Reynolds launched into an energetic explanation of linear equations, her enthusiasm noticeably amplified. And as you can see, she said brightly, writing quickly on the board, consistency is the key to success. The words felt ironic. Mr. Thompson didn't sit immediately. Instead, he walked slowly between the rows of desks, observing students' notebooks. He nodded occasionally, asked one or two quiet questions. Then he stopped, right beside Daniel's desk. Daniel froze. "Hello," Mr. Thompson said gently. Daniel looked up, startled. "Hi. What's your name?" "Daniel Harper." Mr. Thompson studied him carefully, not in a judgmental way, but with curiosity. "Daniel," he repeated thoughtfully, "would you mind if I asked you something?" Daniel hesitated. Mrs. Reynolds turned around quickly, alert. "Go ahead," Daniel said quietly. "How did you feel about last week's exam?" The question caught Mrs. Reynolds off guard. Daniel swallowed. "It was hard," he admitted. "I tried to study." Mr. Thompson nodded slowly. "And do you feel you understand the material better now?" Daniel considered the question honestly. "Some of it," he replied. "But I think I learned better when I can see how it works in real life." A few students looked surprised. Daniel rarely spoke that much in class. Mr. Thompson's expression shifted, a subtle spark of interest in his eyes. "That's an important insight," he said. Mrs. Reynolds stepped forward, slightly defensive. "Daniel has potential," she added quickly. "He just needs to apply himself more consistently." Mr. Thompson gave her a polite smile, but didn't respond directly. Instead, he asked Daniel another question. "Daniel, do you remember submitting a project last spring to the National Youth Innovation Program?" Daniel's heart skipped. He hadn't expected that. "Yes, sir," he answered cautiously. The class went quiet. Mrs. Reynolds frowned. "Project." Mr. Thompson turned to face the room. "Daniel designed a prototype for a low-cost emergency communication device," he explained. "It was built primarily from recycled electronic components." Whispers spread instantly. "That was you?" someone muttered. Daniel felt his face heat up. "It wasn't a big deal," he said quickly. "It was just something I was working on." Mr. Thompson shook his head gently. "It was more than something, Daniel. It demonstrated advanced problem-solving, engineering creativity, and resource efficiency." He paused, letting the words settle. It caught the attention of analysts working with the Department of Defense. The room fell completely silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed louder now. Mrs. Reynolds blinked rapidly. "Department of Defense?" "Yes," Mr. Thompson said calmly. "I serve as a technology outreach coordinator for a Pentagon innovation initiative." The word Pentagon landed like thunder. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He remembered the night he had mailed that prototype, carefully packaged in a reused shoebox. He hadn't expected anything. He just wanted to see if it worked outside his bedroom experiments. "I didn't know it went that far," Daniel whispered. "It did," Mr. Thompson replied. "Your device uses minimal power, operates on improvised networks, and can transmit basic emergency signals in low infrastructure areas. That has real-world applications." Mrs. Reynolds stood speechless. Students who had barely noticed Daniel before were now staring at him like he was someone entirely new. "You built that from scrap parts?" a boy from the front row asked in disbelief. Daniel nodded slightly. "Mostly old radios. And a broken router." Mr. Thompson smiled. "That kind of ingenuity can't be taught easily," he said. "It comes from persistence." His eyes briefly shifted toward Mrs. Reynolds, not accusatory, but meaningful. "Sometimes," he continued carefully, "talent doesn't show up as perfect test scores. Sometimes it shows up as quiet resilience." Daniel felt something unfamiliar rise inside him. Not pride, not exactly. Validation. For years, he had built things in silence. Fixed neighbors' electronics. helped classmates with small tech problems. None of it had seemed important in a classroom focused on numbers and grades. Until now, Mr. Thompson reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin envelope. "We are inviting you, Daniel, to participate in a summer mentorship program sponsored by our innovation department." Gasps filled the room. Daniel stared at the envelope like it might disappear. "It includes hands-on engineering workshops, professional mentorship, and the opportunity to further develop your design," Mr. Thompson explained. I don't know what to say," Daniel managed. "You don't have to say anything right now," Mr. Thompson replied kindly. "Just keep building." Mrs. Reynolds finally found her voice. "I had no idea," she said quietly. Mr. Thompson turned to her respectfully. "Many students carry abilities we can't measure with standard tests," he said. "Encouragement can unlock them. Discouragement can bury them." The message wasn't loud, but it was clear. Daniel felt every eye in the classroom on him again, but this time it felt different. Not judgment, curiosity, respect. For the first time that day, he lifted his head fully, and somewhere in that small classroom, the narrative had completely changed. The classroom remained silent long after Mr. Thompson finished speaking. The envelope in Daniel's hands felt heavier than any textbook he had ever carried. He stared at it, afraid to open it, afraid it might somehow vanish if he moved too quickly. Mr. Thompson adjusted his suit jacket and gave Daniel a firm, reassuring nod. "We'll be in contact with your family soon," he said calmly. "Keep believing in your ideas." "I will, sir," Daniel replied, his voice steadier now. With that, Mr. Thompson shook hands with Principal Harris and quietly exited the room. The door closed, and for a moment no one moved. Mrs. Reynolds stood at the front of class, her usual confidence replaced by something unfamiliar, reflection. The students began whispering. "Dude, that's insane. You built something for the Pentagon? Why didn't you tell us?" Daniel didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to attention, especially not this kind. He slowly slid the envelope into his backpack, careful not to bend it. Mrs. Reynolds cleared her throat. "Class," she said softly. Her tone was completely different from earlier. No sharp edges, no impatience. "Let's take a moment." The room quieted again. She walked down the aisle, stopping beside Daniel's desk. For the first time that day, she didn't look at him with frustration. She looked at him with understanding. "Daniel," she began, her voice sincere, "I owe you an apology." The entire class held its breath. "I spoke to you earlier without fully understanding your circumstances or your abilities. That was unfair." Daniel looked up slowly. "I shouldn't have assumed your effort based solely on a test score," she continued. "And I certainly shouldn't have addressed you the way I did in front of everyone." Her honesty surprised the students just as much as Mr. Thompson's announcement had. Daniel felt a knot loosen in his chest. "It's okay," he said quietly. But Mrs. Reynolds shook her head gently. "No, it's not just okay. Words matter. Teachers are supposed to guide, not discourage." There was something powerful about seeing an adult admit a mistake. It shifted the energy in the room completely. She turned to face the rest of the class. "I want all of you to understand something," she said. "Success doesn't look the same for everyone. Some of you may shine on tests. Others may shine in ways we haven't even discovered yet." Her eyes briefly returned to Daniel. "And it's our responsibility, mine especially, to create space for that." The bell rang suddenly, signaling the end of the period, but no one jumped up like they usually did. Instead, students approached Daniel's desk. "That device thing, how does it work?" one boy asked. "Can you really send signals without Wi-Fi?" another said. Daniel hesitated at first, then slowly began explaining. "It uses radio frequency signals," he said, gaining confidence as he spoke. "I modified a basic transmitter circuit so it can run on low voltage. It doesn't need a full network, just enough signal to carry a distress ping." The students listened carefully. Mrs. Reynolds watched from the front of the room. For the first time, she wasn't just seeing a struggling student. She was seeing a young engineer. Over the next few weeks, subtle changes began unfolding in room 204. Mrs. Reynolds introduced something new: Application Fridays. Every Friday, instead of traditional worksheets, students would explore how math connected to real-world problems: engineering, architecture, finance, technology. When she introduced the first project, she surprised everyone. "Daniel," she said, "would you be willing to demonstrate how algebra played a role in your prototype design?" Daniel's eyes widened. "Me? Yes," she smiled. "If you're comfortable." He hesitated, then nodded. Standing at the front of the class felt completely different from sitting in the back row. His hands trembled slightly at first, but once he started explaining voltage ratios and signal frequencies, his nervousness faded. This was his world. This made sense to him. The class listened, engaged in a way they never had before. Even students who usually struggled seemed more interested when math felt practical and tangible. After class, Mrs. Reynolds approached him. "You have a gift for explaining complex ideas simply," she said. "Have you ever considered teaching someday?" Daniel blinked in surprise. "I never thought about it." "Well," she replied warmly, "you'd be good at it." It was a small comment, but it meant everything. At home, Daniel showed the envelope to his mother that evening. She read the letter twice, tears filling her eyes. "They want you in a national mentorship program?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. His mother pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," she said. "You did this yourself." For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to fully believe that maybe, just maybe, his circumstances didn't define his future. Back at school, the change didn't go unnoticed. Students treated him differently. Not because he was connected to the Pentagon, but because they had seen a side of him they never knew existed. Even Mrs. Reynolds continued to evolve. She started meeting privately with students who were struggling instead of calling them out publicly. She asked questions before making assumptions. "What's going on outside of school?" she would ask gently. Sometimes the answer surprised her. She began to understand that behind every low grade was a story. And sometimes behind quiet students were extraordinary abilities waiting to be seen. Months later, Daniel left for the summer mentorship program. On his last day before break, Mrs. Reynolds handed him a small notebook. "For your ideas," she said. "The world needs them." Daniel smiled. "Thank you for believing in me." She shook her head lightly. "Thank you for teaching me something, too." As Daniel walked out of room 2O for that day, he didn't feel like the poor kid in the back row anymore. He felt capable, seen, valued, and somewhere in that classroom, an even bigger lesson had taken place. Not about algebra, not about test scores, but about perspective. Because sometimes the student who seems to be falling behind is actually miles ahead. They just need someone willing to look beyond the surface. And sometimes all it takes to change a life is one unexpected knock at the door.